Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. My name is Jasper Dent. I'm the events coordinator here at McNally Robinson, Saskatoon. This event is being held on Treaty 6 territory. This is the land of the Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota, and homeland of the Métis Nation. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Saskatoon launch of Tommy Douglas and the Quest for Medicare in Canada. This book is published by University of Toronto Press, and we have joining us tonight the author, Gregory Marchildon. We also have two very special guests joining us, Erika Dyck and Lorne Calvert. Thank you all of you for being here tonight for this fantastic to-be discussion. Please note this event is being live streamed. We've got a web camera just up at the front here. It will be focused on the stage portion, not on the audience, but if your cell phone goes off, it might pick that up and eternalize your embarrassment online. So please turn off or mute your cell phones. If you'd like to buy copies of Tommy Douglas, we have copies up here on the signing table, also on the desk by where you first walked in. You're welcome to get your book signed before you purchase it. We just ask that you please do remember to pay for it on your way out at the cash desk. And now I'd like to introduce each of our speakers this evening. Gregory Marchildon, author of the book, is Professor Emeritus at the University of Toronto and the founding director of the North American Observatory on Health Systems and Politics. He's written extensively on 20th-century Canadian history and contemporary public policy, including comparative health politics and policy. His latest book is the culmination of many years of research and writing. He's a member of the Order of Canada and a fellow of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences. Also joining us is Erika Dyck, professor and a Canada Research Chair in the History of Health and Social Justice at the U of S. She's the author or co-author of several books, several of which we also have in store if you'd like to check those out. Psychedelic Psychiatry in 2008, Managing Madness in 2017, The Acid Room in 2022, and Psychedelics, A Visual Odyssey in 2024. She's the co-editor of Women in Psychedelics 2024 and Expanding Mindscapes 2023. Erika is the co-editor of two McGill Queen's University Press book series on the history of medicine and is currently the president of the Alcohol and Drugs History Society. And we have Lorne Calvert. Lorne is an ordained minister in the United Church of Canada and was first elected to Saskatchewan legislature in 1986. He sat as the member from Moose Jaw Wakamo and subsequently as the member from Saskatoon Riversdale. He has served as the Associate Minister of Health, and Minister of Social Services. Elected as the leader of the New Democrat Party in 2001, he served as Premier of Saskatchewan from 2001 to 2007. Following his legislative career, Calvert worked with St. Andrew's College, University of Saskatchewan as the college principal. Now, I have certainly talked enough, so I'm going to hand the microphone over here, and please give our speakers a warm welcome.
I'm going to be your host this evening for the next 45 minutes or so, but first I wanted to pass the microphone or turn on the microphone to the fellow in the middle here, who needs no further introduction. He's written this short book, perhaps the definitive book on someone who I recognize a few faces here. We've all worked hard to keep memorialized. But Greg, maybe you could start us off by giving us just a quick overview of this 623-page book.
Well, to state the obvious, it's a combination biography and the history is of Medicare. And initially, this book was going to be strictly a history of Medicare, but I've had the opportunity over many years to work on Douglas's life, and I began to realize, as I did more and more of this work, the extent to which his biography fit almost perfectly with the history of Medicare. And I decided to combine the two. And then I decided, despite the 14 other biographies that are out there, to do as complete a biography as I could as it related to Medicare, mainly because I had access to a lot of primary material that really hadn't been used before. and it shed a somewhat different light, I think, on Tommy Douglas. And I wanted to bring that both to life, and I think it added a lot to our knowledge of not only him, but the government which he headed, what he was trying to do, and why this was his singular policy. So the book, it kind of starts right in the middle with one date, which is October the 13th, 1961, which is the dividing line in his life. And I decided to put the reader into the middle of that day as Douglas is waiting to speak, and then when he speaks. And that is because that is when the Medicare bill is introduced in the House. And for the first time after months of criticism, he has the opportunity to explain what his government is trying to do. And it reflects both his desire to finally accomplish what he had set out to accomplish, but also his anxiety and fears about what is about to occur. When I don't need to go into much depth in that, except to say less than a year later would be the 23-day doctor strike in Saskatchewan, which would very much divide the province. Then I go into his past. It's the prequel to Medicare, and the focus in that is on the Great Depression. Both chapters are very much influenced by the Great Depression and the impact on Douglas, the reason why he decided to go into political life directly from being a Baptist minister, and his own radicalization at the time, and because of the extremity of the conditions at the time, and how he saw the conditions and why he felt that that there needed to be major change. So that then leads me to the next big block of chapters, which deal with universal hospital coverage and a number of other changes beyond hospital insurance that were really first in the country that he was able to introduce. And for the first 5 years as the Minister of Public Health, as well as the Premier. And then it goes through the rest of that time, as well as his influence on the national stage. And so that covers the 1940s and the 1950s, and it constitutes about 10 chapters. And then the next block of chapters, another about 7, 8 chapters, deals with the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s with the addition of medical care coverage to universal hospital coverage, both in Saskatchewan and again on the national stage, and Douglas's centrality and all of that, right up to the problems of the 1970s. The Medical Care Act that the federal government passed in 1966 had some deficiencies that became evident by the end of the 1970s. And as a consequence, the Canada Health Act was passed in 1984 to address those problems. And Douglas's personal role, both as leader of the New Democratic Party from 61 to 71, but then later as an MP and critic, and then even later outside the House of Commons as an advocate. And so that's basically the book.
So I believe in the introduction, you mentioned that this book took about 20 years to write. But I happen to have known you for some of those years, and you weren't just thinking about the right words. You were busy doing other things, running a government, starting a school, opening up a new North American Observatory on healthcare. And I wondered if you could reflect a little bit on what it meant to be working in those various capacities, both as in a bureaucratic capacity, but also as an academic, thinking about healthcare systems. And how did that influence the way that you decided to write this book? Or why do you think it was important to write this book after having served in those other roles? And Lorne, I'm going to ask you the same question as a reader later. So
Okay, well, first I want to correct the record on one thing. I was never running a government. People like this ran governments. I was simply the hired help.
Don't be fooled.
But yes, I was, involved with the World Health Organization and various other organizations providing advice to governments outside Canada, occasionally within Canada, while I was an academic. And I didn't draw a distinction between those things, but the truth of the matter was that there were a lot of very urgent policy challenges, not just within Canada, but other countries. And I was always trying to figure out, in the case of these other countries, the origins of universal health coverage, why every country had a slightly different and sometimes quite different what I would call approach to universal health coverage, and at times, as in the United States, no universal health coverage. And that took me to history. And so I began to do comparative history, comparing Canada to other countries. And that then led to me trying to go in deeper and deeper. I was not satisfied with what I had read and studied in terms of Canada in the secondary literature. So I began to do a lot of primary research, and I did a number of journal articles, and then I decided to do the larger piece of work, but it seemed overwhelming. A lot of the time, as you well know, as you try to encourage me to continue working on the book, but I kept putting it off and working on little pieces instead, because the big picture just seemed so overwhelming. And I'll tell you why it was overwhelming. There was so much that had been written about it. And then when I started doing the archival research and the research through primary sources, newspapers of the day, etc., it was just a flood of available material. And picking your way through it was very difficult, and it was all contested. There were very different perspectives. They could not be put together in a coherent whole. And so I had to try to get to the bottom of these competing perspectives and arguments. And the good part of it was it reflected not just history, but it reflected the current debates that we were in. And I began to get a different perspective on the current debates. And when I would address the current debates, as I often had to because of my work, I was able to do so by drawing on that rich history. So it wasn't a waste of time. The advance contract for the book I received in 2001, and I did not deliver the manuscript until last year. So I had an extremely patient publisher, I must say.
Now, Lorne, I wonder if I can ask you to reflect on this as a reader. I will divulge a little bit about myself here. There was a time that I could have told you about roughly what the voter turnout was in Riversdale. I knocked on many doors. I grew up in that, what was then the riding. It's recently changed its boundaries. But I remember working on some of your campaigns, and it struck me in reading the book and reflecting back on those times as a teenager and 20-year-old something or other. There's a really strong thread of social gospel that Tommy Douglas comes into, and the way that he blends religion and vision into his politics come through really nicely in this book. And I wonder, as a reader, how that resonated with you, or where you saw yourself in this book.
Let me say that I bona fide wished that I could have had this book when we were in government. And particularly, of course, when I was working in health. Friends, I've learned an awful lot from this book. I thought I knew the story of Medicare. Well, I didn't. And so to have this kind of a compilation of the narratives, the history, and the personality and person of Douglas woven together, I just found it as a reader, it's a powerful, powerful tool as we're thinking about healthcare today and in the future. And if Out of the book, I conclude that if healthcare in some ways began in rural Saskatchewan, or Medicare and universal healthcare beginning in rural Saskatchewan, is it time again that for rural Saskatchewan, from Saskatchewan, that we pioneer the next stages? We shouldn't fear that. Our ancestors did not fear. I just think this is an invaluable resource. I hope every member of our current caucus has access to this, and that it's widely read among our healthcare thinkers and providers in the province. Now, in terms of the social gospel, oh, this warms my heart. It just warms my heart. And Greg, you've captured both the man, that social gospel that motivated him, and the outcome.
You decided to start this book kind of on the eve of a strike. And I've learned recently that the National Commission for Heritage Sites, and I'm probably getting the acronym wrong, is going to honor the doctor's strike and is going to become part of national heritage. What does it mean to you that this foundational moment in Medicare's history is going to get that national recognition as a historic site? And what is that going to do for the sales of your book?
Well, I can answer the last part easily, not much. But on the first part, I think it's absolutely great that this has occurred. But it's classified as an event. And I think people need to see something physical as well. So I do hope that there will be a plaque. I'd like to shove a plaque right up against the Medical Arts Building. I'd like to put another one at the Legislative Building. I used to do private tours of the Legislative Building in terms of Medicare, because I really think that it deserves a plaque as well. But I also think, for example, the Besborough Hotel should have a plaque as well, because that was the locus of a lot of the negotiating that led to the Saskatoon agreement. And then people can really see it every day. I think it's great, but I also think that it reflects a kind of what I would call a domestication of the issue, because it means that it's safe enough now to do this. It's far enough back in the past. The truth is, it remains a highly polarizing issue. It is still something which people will be on one side or the other of. It takes different terminology, somewhat different form. We argue about the current so-called crisis in healthcare. There are those that feel that it can be fixed from within. That's a problem of management, not with the principles. Others that feel that the very principles are the fatal flaw in the system. And so we do have that division. We all know that we have enormous challenges that we have to address. And it's hard to defend and I hate to use the word system, but healthcare that is not functioning properly. And I don't defend it. And as you know, I spend a lot of my time talking about the reforms that are necessary, and some of them need to be fundamental, but not the basic principles. And defending single tier and single payer coverage in the way that we've done it, I think is the great advantage. But it's a lot of the other stuff that we really need to fix. But this, we will continue to debate this, and I wish that and I hope that this designation will lead to a richer discussion, number one, and a greater understanding, because it's hard to have a debate when you're all starting from a different position and even misperceptions of the past.
And Lorne, what does it mean to decorate Saskatchewan with these emblems of Medicare? What does it mean to really sort of focus on Saskatchewan once more as the birthplace of Medicare?
Well, I certainly welcome this. I wasn't aware that this was happening, so I certainly welcome it. It is important, I think, for us to, in some ways, memorialize the events of our history. And this is true also when we go beyond the colonizers to our First Nations and so on, that we have those markers. And where better than somewhere at medical arts in Besborough or somewhere in between. We should have called that place Lord Taylor, that little corridor. So I'm very happy to hear this. There are some of those plaques and so on around the place. I recall the celebrated Orville Jurdis, for instance, by putting his picture, we named the health department building in Regina, Tommy Douglas building and so on. But to have that specific reference to that crucible moment, I mean, that strike and those days, I mean, I think shaped our province in many ways. And I recall that Tommy served as the architect, I would say, but Woodrow was the implementer, and the two of them were together at that time. So I think it's good news to hear this. I'm happy it's happening.
One of the many things that unfolds in these pages is a story of a lot of hard work, a lot of rolling up his sleeves, a lot of pragmatism. And there's this really interesting interplay between the vision of healthcare reforms, or what we come to know as Medicare, but also a lot of just sitting down and having conversations, trying to think of alternatives, drawing from different jurisdictions, drawing from different people. That must have been really tedious to piece together all of the kinds of relationships, and yet you've pulled it together into a narrative that shows how Tommy Douglas had both a vision, but also a kind of, I don't know, an incredible work ethic to continue to build these relationships, sometimes against the odds. Can you paint a little bit of a picture there for us?
Well, of course, it required a very, very large and talented group of people to pull this off. And it was in numerous areas. Universal hospital insurance was one area, but the whole program of regionalization was yet another. Mental health reform was yet another, as you know. And I could keep going through the list. And the one thing that I would note is that Douglas did not stint on the amount of time he spent in recruiting people. He was enormously able in spotting talent, and he would do things including flying to Washington, D.C. to convince somebody to come to Saskatchewan to work with him on program. And he did this over and over. Yeah, he was Minister of Health, but he was also the Premier, and premiers do not have a lot of time, but he felt that that investment was essential doing it. And he was open to everyone as long as they had a talent. He was not inclined to simply get Canadians. He got people from the United States or Britain or wherever. He was also prepared to hire people that couldn't be hired and weren't being hired in the rest of the country. A whole group of Japanese Canadians that couldn't get a job in any other government in the country, as well as a group of Jewish Canadians, whether they came from Toronto or they came from Winnipeg in the North End. Extremely talented people who were being precluded from getting jobs in other places because of the prejudices of the day. And he brought them in, and he, created it. And it wasn't easy because there were a lot of folks within Saskatchewan that said, oh, they're from away. And, we shouldn't have these carpetbaggers here. And Douglas fought that. He fought that kind of parochialism every day. Say no. And he was glad to bring in people, and they were glad to work because they were able to, in a sense, do what they felt was right. He gave them the room. He made it very clear that he set and his government set political direction, and that no bureaucrat would ever do that. But at the same time, they were the technical experts, and he would listen to whatever they had to say, and he gave them their brains, and they appreciated that. And so that sort of role definition and that, I would say, opportunity to really do something unique brought a lot of people here. And some of them may have only stayed 4 years, but they accomplished a great deal of time that they spent here. Others spent the rest of their careers here until they went to Ottawa in 1964. And they benefited the federal public service as well.
I'm not sure if the entire Saskatchewan Mafia left. I have to go read the other book that you worked on. But Lorne, when you came into government, did you sense a legacy of that kind of spirit of cooperation and to look outside of the borders of this province to find answers to complex solutions that were rooted yet in the province?
One thing I have learned from Greg's book is just on this subject. I did not have the understanding of the breadth and the depth of those that Tommy Douglas and his government brought into Saskatchewan. This is an amazing story. Segrist on the cover of Time magazine. And the premier of a small province could go and convince that man to come and work in Saskatchewan. This is why I wish I had access to this book. It would have given our government perhaps a little more courage to reach out and find that kind of expertise and that kind of thinking. The other capacity that has for many years, I need to be careful here, but perhaps up until more recent years, has been the great strength of the public service in Saskatchewan. And Roy Romano insisted on a strong public service, and I inherited a strong public service. And that makes a huge difference in the competence and ability of a government to bring about the kind of societal and change that you want to do. It has been a long tradition of Saskatchewan, a strong public service, but this tradition of reaching out to Britain, to New York, to Washington, to Winnipeg, and bringing in those folks, it's an amazing story.
It's partly where we get the word psychedelic, but that's for another story. Catch me later. I know I don't have any supplies. Just needed some comic relief. I really like the way that these elements of social justice and human rights are kind of woven into the story, that it is a story primarily about a man and a policy, but along the way it's dotted with all of these intriguing details that help us understand not only the shape of the province, but where the province sat in the world. But one of the areas that gets a little bit of a rougher ride, I think, certainly in the secondary literature, is the treatment of Indigenous health. And I wonder if you can reflect a little bit on that. I know over the years we've talked about this a little bit, and it fits into the book as well. And also maybe you can reflect a little bit on where we've come since these earlier days on Indigenous healthcare in the province.
Okay, well, I think there was sort of two phases before what I wrote and I had to contend with. The first phase was largely ignoring Indigenous health, what was done in the province, or an assumption that what was done by the Douglas government was generally good because it was aimed to benefit the majority of the population, including Indigenous people. And then a kind of a reaction against that in the last 30 years, and a attack on the Douglas government in particular for the fact that it didn't do enough, or that it approached things from a welfare perspective. By that I mean welfare for the greatest number, without taking into consideration the unique history and needs of the Indigenous population in the province. And I looked at that seriously, and I went through it, and I began to compare Saskatchewan to other provinces. And I suppose you'd say that my position was probably in between those two positions. I came to the conclusion, based upon hard evidence, the evidence that I could find, that first of all, Saskatchewan did much more than any other province by a country mile in terms of setting up northern, what I would call health clinics, etc. In most of the other provinces in the far north and in isolated Indigenous communities, the federal government had nursing stations. There was virtually none of that in northern Saskatchewan, and the one that did exist, Douglas felt that it was insufficient. So he put in provincial clinics throughout the north, paid for entirely by the Saskatchewan taxpayer. even though other provinces felt that that was a federal responsibility and they should be spending the money, and therefore they refused to spend the money. And that went alongside some of the earlier institutions, including the Roman Catholic and Anglican missions, and some of the charities. And the end result was much better coverage of the North than existed before. But at the same time, the health regions only went to the Northern Administrative Line, did not and were not intended to go further north. There was a special arrangement. Instead of having the air ambulances in the north, it went through basically the Crown corporations, and they weren't set up as well as the air ambulance, what was a remarkable air ambulance service, the first of its type in the country. So there were deficiencies for sure, and there wasn't sort of a real effort to say, no, the challenges here are of a fundamentally different nature than other challenges. Douglas continued to believe that it was mainly a problem of poverty and lack of opportunity in terms of education. He, I don't think, looked at the cultural dimension the same way. And that was probably very consistent with social democratic thinking of the day. And it's also very consistent with what social democrats are doing in other countries and other settler societies as well. So it was an area where, you know, in some ways he was very much ahead of the trend, but in other areas very much in the same, and sort of not ahead of the trend. So very much a product of his time.
Do you want to add anything in terms of how the state of Indigenous health when you were either health minister or as premier?
I'd like to think that we might be also described as somewhat ahead of our time and some ways behind. I think that's a fair description. It's nice to see Eric Klein here tonight from the days when we governed together. I look at the Fort Capel Hospital, Indian Hospital in Port Capel, as a major step forward where we're beginning to see First Nations people into more active organization and delivery of healthcare on and off reserve. I think of the efforts we made in terms of training, providing opportunities for First Nations and Métis peoples to become part of nursing professions and so on and so on. In our time, and these are the days before the Truth and Reconciliation thoughts and so on, and some of the understandings that we've gained since then about the residential schools and so on. In our time, we perhaps still hung to the very traditional definitions of healthcare and medicine. Perhaps didn't understand some of those cultural differences, holistic medicine, the kind of medicines that the elders bring to the table and so on. I think that has grown, but there's still some real long ways to go. And here's where the determinants of health become so important. And if we haven't tackled as we should the determinants of health, it shows a distinct implication in First Nations and Métis peoples.
One of the other lessons that I take from reading this book is that, you know, Medicare was never meant to be, you know, chiseled into stone and kept as this one piece, but it was a fluid set of policies that build towards a set of principles and allow for some flexibility to take the shape that they needed to, in our case, the shape of a trapezoid. But I wonder, what did Douglas see, and what do you each see as the next step that we should be taking as we go forward? Because of course you've had opportunity to see this beyond Douglas. Where would you take Medicare next?
Well, it's a two-front battle in my view. The first is to continue expanding coverage, particularly in those areas where you need the greater integration, you need the ability to cost control, and you need much better access for a lot of Canadians. This is something we've talked about since the 1960s, but we've not done a damn thing really in terms of improving access through better coverage. And there are ways that it needs to be done so it's affordable. It has to be done in stages. But, 60 years have gone by and we've missed a lot of stages. And so we've got some catching up to do. It is true that Canada's form of universal health coverage is deep, has good coverage for what it provides, but what it covers is very narrow relative to all other OECD countries. So we've fallen behind, but we've also fallen behind in terms of the way in which we organize services, the way in which we've ensured that we put greater emphasis on the upstream, on population health, and the extent to which we still don't sort of connect the dots in terms of the determinants of health, as Lorne has pointed out. And we have an enormous amount of work to do in that area. It's not all been, failure, though. People talk about how Canada performs so poorly, but I have a lecture that I work on every year, and every summer I go and do this comparative thing at Harvard, and I have to set out all of the international data. And Canada comes out much better than what most Canadians expect based upon very hard data. But we could do so much better. We are a wealthy country. We know a lot of the things that we should be doing. And we have a system through this single payer mechanism that allows us to do it, yet we don't do it.
Lorne, where should we be taking Medicare next?
Well, not where Brother Trump wants us to take it. And living beside a rogue president, a rogue government, makes Greg's work and this conversation, I think, extremely important. I think Greg has just made a very valuable comment here. Because of our single payer system, we have some capacity that doesn't exist in the multi-payer, the personal payer systems. We do need to address capacity. We can't have emergency wards that are leaving people in the hallways, because that's a great threat to the principles of Medicare. People take it out not on the current regime, but on the principles of Medicare, thinking that there's a private solution somewhere. So we need to deal with capacity. We can't have this kind of circumstance we have today. But we can't just simply build more and more capacity in the acute care system. We tried in the 1990s to move. We described it as the wellness model. And we were familiar with saying that Douglas had a vision for health hospitalization and physician care. But the next stage was to move to the more preventative determinant of health and so on. And we haven't got there. In fact, we've gone backwards, I think. We need to bring professions together. I think the team approach to providing medical care is important, and to significantly look at the determinants.
Are you okay if I ask for questions from the audience also?
Yes, of course.
Does the audience want to ask any questions? I can run the mic. If there are questions, otherwise I'll keep going, but if there are questions, I'll bring the microphone.
Hello. Well, if we're talking about the future, could you comment on the AI aspect of the future of healthcare?
Well, I think it presents many potential opportunities. There are some caveats in terms of protection need to be built in. And it's not a complete solution. We still need, healthcare is still a high service. It's a high service sector that requires people. And we have to, in a sense, work on that at the same time. And there are some areas of healthcare that can really benefit from AI and from modern forms of communication and information technology, and we can do a lot better in terms of servicing in rural and remote areas because of that. And so providers that live in those areas can communicate much more effectively. And families who are separated at times of illness can communicate with each other. I mean, those are really positive things, but we have to bring it together. And we have to realize that it's not a magic pill. It doesn't replace a lot of what we still have to do. So we are only beginning to understand the implications of artificial intelligence. And so I can't say much more than that because I'm just looking through a glass darkly like everyone else on this one.
Tommy Douglas was a pioneer in Canada, but I was wondering in relation to the world, were there any other countries at the time that Tommy Douglas was doing his work that were working in a similar way or ahead of us, or how would you respond to that?
Yeah, there were the three countries that I talk about are New Zealand, the United States, and the United Kingdom. And I don't get into these Nordic countries very much because they had social health insurance along with many continental countries, which only really were set up to serve working families that work for larger enterprises, so urban workers. And until many years later, everyone else was bypassed. So they weren't universal coverage systems. But in the case of New Zealand and Britain, there was an effort to go in that direction. And New Zealand was the first. In the mid-1930s, a new government came into power, and it basically created social security legislation that covered everyone for not only employment insurance, but also for health care. The problem was in terms of the actual implementation and the opposition of the medical association in New Zealand. And the government had to backtrack from its original intentions. And they ended up with a public and private system, and they ended up with a system that had very high user fees and co-payments. And that this was already evident by 1942, 1943. So Douglas tried to learn from New Zealand, but he also knew that there were serious problems and needed to, in a sense, avoid the problems that had arisen in New Zealand. The only other place that was comparative in terms of universal health coverage was Britain, and it had stated its intention by 1945 to move in that direction, but nothing was implemented until July of 1948. Douglas already had a bill on universal hospital coverage in 1946 and began implementation in January 1st, 1947. There were no other models in the world that he could rely upon or his government could rely upon. The one thing that did exist was south of the border. The Roosevelt government, through the New Deal, had set up what we really were pools of coverage for poor farmers and migrant farm workers. And he drew on three of the people that worked on those programs to come to Saskatchewan because that was the only place where they'd actually implemented anything that was close to what Douglas wanted to implement, but on a universal basis, not targeting a subgroup. So that was basically it at the time. Later on, there were other examples that emerged, but Douglas already had it, and Saskatchewan already had a functioning system of universal hospital coverage, as well as a whole set of health regions.
Other questions from the audience? Or I can go sit down again.
thanks to all of you, and thanks, Greg. You really brought this history to life. As Lorne says, it resonates a lot more. So my question is also about the future. As you know, I look at climate past characteristics and future characteristics. And also, as you know, we are encountering more heat, more drought, more possibility of floods that Daryl has also worked on. And a lot of this has very strong implications for health. So what do you see coming out of your book that has the most implications for a changing climate in the future, with different pests, with drought, with especially problems for water quality, for instance, water amounts and so on? You've probably thought about this.
Well, yeah, but nothing directly comes out of the book. I have to admit that. Indirectly, clearly the efforts and the focus of regionalization of the type that was done in Saskatchewan at that time, which was based upon local government. It wasn't an imposition of the provincial government in what had been the worst drought-stricken part of the province and the poorest part of the province. And that's where the experimentation went furthest. That was the Swift Current Health region. And there, dealing with all of the, what I would call all of the problems, all of the health issues that came out of the Great Depression, which is the reason that they needed, for example, some form of access to dental, basic dental care, because people so lacked access during the Great Depression that basically well over 60% of the population had dental diseases of a very serious type. And it's numbers that are, you know, absolutely astronomical. And that was a direct result of not just depression, but actually drought. And of course, that remains one of the most, what I would call, sensitive areas in the country, along with the neighboring area on the Alberta side, as you know, Elaine. And we need to continue to keep that in mind. And yet we've lost some of the institutions like the PFRA that used to deal directly with it. And we need to, in a sense, create these institutions in another way so that we're going to be ready to deal with what invariably will be the result of longer term climate change. By longer term, I'm not talking about 100, 200 years. We're talking 10 years, 20 years, 30 years.
Thank you. Were there any other questions from the audience they missed? I've got one for Lorne. Why should we pick this book up off the shelf and read it today? What does it mean to return to both the man and the vision and this central policy that we've come to enjoy?
Let me say first of all, Greg knows this. About a week and a half ago, our daughter and her husband presented Betty and I with a new little grandbaby. I was holding the baby in one arm and Greg's book in the other arm. They weighed about the same. So there's some physical health to just reading this book. But also let me say this. When Greg and Steph brought their baby home from the hospital, they were given a lot of information, literature, educational materials. They were also given a sheet of paper that talked about the midwife who would visit them twice in the first week and the public health nurse who was coming next week and so on and so on. The one thing they weren't given was a bill or an invoice. Directly the result of Tommy Douglas and the quest for Medicare in Canada. We should read this book to understand that. You know, it's 80 years or more, I guess 81 since 44. We're soon going to be approaching a century since the inception and the dream and the practical application of Medicare happened. We need to read this to know where we've come from. I'm a bit with Henry Ford, if we don't know where we come from, why do we know where we're going? And Greg has given us a chance in a very concise way to see where we have come from. And there's just a great deal in this book that lends itself to thinking of where shall we go? And I'm curious, I'd love to ask Greg this question. Now, this is maybe a little bit of inside baseball. When I think of the pushback against Medicare, I mean, this was a battle royal, unlike any other that I think our province has lived through. Now, in the 90s, when we were involved with government, we undertook some significant healthcare reform in terms of district delivery, the new concept of health regions, the concept of conversion of empty acute care hospitals to health centers that provided services in communities. I used to attend meetings, 300 and 400 people came out to greet me. They were not particularly happy to see me. In those days, there was a difficulty in our caucus. There were those who went south on us, those who protested internally, those who protested quietly in their own constituencies, pretending that, it wasn't their fault. I look at the stress that must have been on that cabinet and caucus during a doctor's strike. How did they hold that group together? Was it the personality and the persuasiveness of Douglas? What held them together?
Well, that's a tough one because they held together, but barely. This had already become evident by the time Douglas had left in November of 1961. Douglas did everything he could. His successor, Woodrow Lloyd, did everything he could, but the cabinet nonetheless was split between hawks and doves. And the doves wanted to do a deal. They were prepared to accept multi-payer insurance. They were prepared to basically allow the physician-operated insurance companies be in the driver's seat. And they were prepared to allow fairly substantial co-payments and user fees if it would bring peace. The hawks, on the other hand, disagreed completely with that, but also felt that the doctors were being outrageous and needed to be given a lesson. And so I know this because I spent a lot of time talking to Alan Blakeney, and Alan Blakeney told me point blank, yes, he was one of the hawks for sure. And he actually wrote the legislation that went into the House in April of 1962 that so infuriated the doctors. What he was trying to do was protect against a strike, and he was trying to undermine the power wielded by the College of Physicians and Surgeons, and he threatened the doctors that their right of self-regulation could be taken away. Then there was Lloyd in the middle, and Lloyd basically said, we can't allow this polarization to go any further. We have to find a workable compromise. If we try to punish the doctors in too great of a way, they're going to leave, so we need to keep them here. And we need to trust that over time, they're going to come on side, even though they hate us now, and they're doing everything they can to bring down our government. So it wasn't easy. And Lloyd paid an enormous price to take that middle position. I couldn't write a great deal about that in the book, but I have a chapter devoted to the doctor's strike where it was very clear it barely hung together. And as you know, the health minister of the day actually left the government and joined the Liberals, and stated point blank that his position as a dove should have been accepted by the rest of the cabinet. And Lloyd wasn't the problem, he said. The problem was Douglas came back onto the scene and forced Lloyd to take a tougher position. That wasn't actually accurate. Lloyd continued to take that middle position throughout the doctor strike and after. Douglas, it is true, had become to take more the hawk position, but he was no longer premier, and he had to be careful because he knew that Woodrow Lloyd needed to run that government, he couldn't be running it from behind the scenes. So it was a very difficult time.
Now, Tommy had that view of there can only be one conductor. When I think of some of the political repercussions of that battle, Tommy lost his seat in Regina. Our government was defeated. Ross Thatcher defeated us, which is illustrative to current governments, I think. Sometimes there's a place to take a stand that's going to have a political consequence. It's going to outlast you. Ross Thatcher didn't tamper with Medicare. Greg, just also on the you make the, I know you make the point in the book that in terms of the strike itself, that both sides rather underestimated the other. Maybe you could say a word about that.
Yes, I think that Douglas honestly believed, at least until he lost the election in June, as the federal seat in Regina, he believed until that moment that the doctors would come around. The doctors just needed to know the government was determined to proceed. And then once they accepted the fact that it was going to happen, that the doctors would negotiate the best deal possible for themselves, which he expected, but that a compromise could be reached. He totally underestimated the fact that the doctors had decided by at least 1961 that they would never compromise. And the doctors honestly believed that the government was going to back off and withdraw the legislation, and that the government could be forced to do that. And they miscalculated. They miscalculated the government's, basically the government's internal strength to continue to proceed, even though everyone in the country, virtually every other provincial government, virtually every provincial medical association, Canadian Medical Association, every professional group in the country, and every chamber of commerce was saying, you know, the doctor's way of doing it is much better, which is to introduce this subsidy and use the physician plans.
I have a comment, is that not, just a clarification, maybe a 50 point, not 100% of the physicians went on strike. Stuart Houston did not. He's one of them. And there were a few. So who knows what internal influence some of the physicians had on with each other. We don't know about any of those conversations.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, I actually had to do some counts on this. And it was less than 2% of the doctors did not actually go on strike. So it wasn't very many. The new doctors coming in, of course, were pro-Medicare, and they weren't going to join. So as they came in, the number grew. But that's not what's important here. What's important is what I would call a silent group of rural physicians, not the high-paid specialists in the city, but the rural physicians that went on strike, but didn't want to stay on strike, out on strike. They truly wanted to help their neighbors and friends. They felt terrible. I'm not saying all of them, but many of them felt terrible about being on strike. And I, in the primary documentation, found enough evidence that the College of Physicians and Surgeons, that is the executive of the college, most of whom were specialists, urban specialists, were becoming more and more afraid that the strike would be broken by these rural doctors. And so they knew that even though they voted in favor of the strike, they didn't think the strike was going to last that long. And they thought the threat would be enough to bring the government around. When it wasn't, they were going to go back to work eventually. And that's when the doctors decided to come to the table and negotiate the Saskatoon Agreement.
Thank you.
So I don't know if I'm right on this, Greg, but wasn't one of the compromises that doctors would get fee for service and not be on salary? That was one of the big compromises, right? Was that a mistake?
Well, there's two things here. One is, yes, it takes the form of fee for service, and there was an agreement through the Saskatoon agreement that would be the conventional way that doctors would receive their remuneration. Didn't close off other possibilities, but that would be the predominant way. So it was privileged in the Saskatoon agreement. But behind that lay something else, which is the doctors wanted clinical autonomy, and they made many of their arguments based upon clinical autonomy, but that had never been contested by the Douglas government. They said, no, doctors would always have clinical autonomy. The question was whether they would all have business autonomy. They would continue to operate as independent businesses. And fee for service allowed you to do that. And that's why the College of Physicians and Surgeons went to the wall to defend fee for service. It wasn't because they particularly liked getting paid in that way. It was because it protected that way of conducting their practices. And yes, I think it was very destructive in terms of the forms of medical care that are not transactional, family medicine, and you can think of psychiatry and a few other areas. That the fee-for-service form of payment produces all the wrong incentives. But when you're talking about surgeons and others, it's probably not as much of an issue, but it's sure an issue in the area of primary care. Sorry.
Uh-oh. I was gonna ask the last question, but I'm gonna leave it for Jim.
Greg, there's, I think, a fascinating subtlety that comes out in your book. And that was the influence of Lord Taylor and the rise and fall of the community clinics. You point out that very rapidly during the course of the strike, cooperative clinics were springing up all over the province very rapidly. And the agreement that Lord Taylor negotiated put the clampers on those. And that subtle, what seems like a subtlety, but you comment, I think, profoundly affected the way that we practice primary care, particularly in the province.
Yes, and it's well known that the Saskatoon Agreement did this, but it's not always understood why. And actually, Lord Taylor played an oversized role. He was totally against the community clinics. He felt that they were similar to the cooperative clinics that existed in Britain. He felt they provided lower quality care by definition, and that any decent physician would not practice in such a clinic. And he brought those prejudices with him. He was met at the Toronto airport before he flew. He flew from London to Toronto. He was picked up by George Cadbury. They ended up having a 4-hour argument on this issue. And Cadbury contacted his friends back in Regina to say, this guy's really dangerous. He wants to tear down the clinics. And he managed to get some of that wording into the Saskatoon Agreement. And it really was like a chokehold on the community clinics.
Did it not affect the development of even successful community clinics like the one in Saskatoon? That included the kind of development they envisaged. Am I right on that point?
Yes, you are right.
Sorry, just like people here couldn't hear the question. So did it affect the development of the community clinics, even the successful ones like the one in Saskatoon? Jim?
Yeah. And then it's you've got to be careful with the word successful. I think that the idea behind the group practice community clinics was much more ambitious than what they could actually do in practice, because the doctors were paid through fee for service, and then they had to give up their fee for service earnings to be pooled to pay the clinic. You could only bring in so many other people. And that meant that they were never as multi-professional as they should have been and the kind of conception that existed at the time. It also meant it created, I think, a real division at times. Saskatoon managed it, but eventually Regina couldn't manage it and the clinic fell apart. Between the doctors on the one hand and the board of directors and the consumers using the clinics. These were consumer co-ops, so that the producers, i.e. the doctors and other providers, couldn't be on the board because of that sort of structure. And this created some real issues. So overall, it was highly problematic. And I think that the way in which the community clinics then worked, because they couldn't live up to their potential, the potential of that model, they never grew in the way that they could have. And as a consequence, we've never, ever had the kind of example in the country that, for example, when you go to the United States and you see these large group practices that have become nonprofit group practices that become very famous and provide very high quality care and have, you know, a patient base of 2 million people. We've never been able to develop that. By the time that global payment was then offered by the Blakeney government early on, and that was because Walter Schmisek understood that as health minister, because at the time he was on the Thompson committee that looked at this whole issue, and he argued very vehemently in favor of salary. And he argued very strongly in favor of community clinics and global payment for community clinics. So he ensured that right after he became Minister of Health, after the Blakeney government was elected, they got global payment, but it was almost too late by that time.
Sounds like we've got a volume 2 in the making here, the community clinic story. I know we're out of time, but I know that there are a lot of people here probably eager to dig into this book and to get some signed copies. So I hope you'll join me in thanking Greg and Lorne for this very stimulating conversation.